The dress was the wrong color. Wren had known it the moment she stepped out of the cab and saw the light spilling from the Aldercroft's lobby doors, warm gold, the kind that made champagne look like liquid fire, and made her department store blue look like something a nurse wore on a Tuesday. She'd told herself it didn't matter. She'd told herself a lot of things on the ride over. Her stepsister Bianca was already inside, of course. Bianca was always already inside. There she is. The voice came from her left, low enough that only a few people nearby could hear it, which somehow made it worse. Bianca was standing near the bar with two women Wren didn't recognize, all three of them holding glasses they hadn't touched. I told you she'd actually come. I owe you $20, laughter. Not the mean, barking kind. The worse kind, light, practiced, the kind that said this doesn't even require effort. Wren kept walking. The Aldercroft's main hall had been rented out for the Hollis Group's annual shareholder gala, and her stepfather Gerald had insisted she attend. "You work for the company," he'd said, like that was the beginning and the end of it. He hadn't said you've worked for it for 6 years. He hadn't said you rebuilt the reconciliation system from scratch last spring and saved us $400,000 in audit penalties. He'd said, "You work for the company, you'll be there." So here she was, in the wrong dress, in the wrong shoes, with a headache starting behind her left eye. The room was full of people she recognized by spreadsheet. Column J, the Hargrove account. Column R, the Delmore Family Trust. She knew their numbers better than she knew their faces, and she preferred it that way. Numbers didn't look through you like you were furniture that had learned to stand upright. She found a corner near the terrace doors, where the air was cooler and the crowd was thin. The city spread out below the windows like something from a movie. Towers lit up, the river a dark seam between the east and west sides. She let herself look at it for a moment, just a moment. "You're blocking the column?" She turned. A man in a grey suit was standing about 4 feet away, not looking at her but at the wall behind her, where a bronze column extended from floor to ceiling. He had a drink in one hand, and the particular stillness of someone who was only pretending not to be in pain. "Sorry," she said, and stepped to the left. He didn't thank her. He stood where she'd been standing and looked at the same view she'd been looking at, and for a moment they just existed in parallel, which was fine by her. Then Bianca appeared. She arrived the way she always did, sudden, bright, too much perfume, with the specific energy of someone who had clocked an audience and decided to perform. She was wearing something green that cost more than Wren's monthly rent, and she looked beautiful and she knew it, and she wanted everyone within 20 feet to know that she knew it. "Wren." Bianca's eyes moved over her. "You look," she paused in the way that meant she was selecting the exact right cruelty. "Tired, long week, you really should have worn the black one. I offered to lend you the black one." She said it to the space between them, not quite to Wren, a performance of helpfulness. "But you never listen." Wren didn't answer. She'd learned years ago that answering was a trap. Bianca didn't want a conversation. She wanted a reaction, something she could shape into a story later. "Gerald says you've been going over the Lachlan acquisition numbers again." Bianca took a sip of her champagne. "He said you flagged something. I flagged several things. He said it was nothing. He would." Bianca's eyes sharpened slightly. That was the thing about Bianca. She wasn't stupid. She just used her intelligence differently than Wren did. "You know, it's actually kind of sad," she said, tilting her head. "You spend all this time in those little rooms with your little spreadsheets, and for what? No one's going to remember your name when Gerald retires. They're going to remember the people in this room." Wren looked at her. "I remember the numbers," she said. "The numbers remember the numbers. That's usually enough." Bianca smiled. It didn't reach anything. "Enjoy your corner, Wren." She left, taking her perfume with her, moving back toward the center of the room like a tide going out. Wren turned back to the window. "That was your sister." The man in the grey suit. She'd almost forgotten he was there. "Stepsister," Wren said. He didn't respond to that. He was looking at the room now instead of the window, the kind of look that wasn't really looking. More like cataloguing. She noticed, without particularly meaning to, that he was older than she'd first thought. Mid-40s. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that weren't from smiling, and his left hand, the one not holding the drink, rested at his side with the fingers slightly curled like an old reflex. "Hollis Group," he said. "Which department?" It wasn't a question exactly. "Finance, internal audit." She paused. "You?" He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'm not with Hollis." Across the room, she could see Gerald moving through the crowd, shaking hands, laughing too loud at things that weren't funny. He hadn't looked in her direction once tonight. She'd counted. "Then why are you here?" she asked. "Same reason anyone's here." He picked up his drink, then put it back down without finishing it. To see what's in the room. She didn't know what to do with that, so she didn't do anything with it. The headache was worse now, a steady pressure above her eye, and she was thinking about the Lachlan file sitting on her desk and the line items she'd flagged that Gerald had unflagged, and whether any of the people in this room actually knew what was happening in the company they'd come here to celebrate. "You said you flagged several things," the man said. She looked at him. "You were listening. I was nearby." He met her eyes briefly, then looked back at the room. "What kind of things?" Wren studied the side of his face for a moment. He had a scar near his jaw, a thin one, old. His suit fit the way suits fit when someone had paid attention to the fitting, and his shoes were dark and quiet and completely wrong for a gala, functional rather than ceremonial. She noticed all of this the way she noticed numbers, without deciding to, and without knowing quite what to do with the information yet. "The kind of things that make the acquisition look cleaner than it is," she said finally. Meaning someone shifted some liabilities around before the valuation. Nothing that would fail a surface audit. But the internal ratios are wrong. The working capital number on page 47 doesn't reconcile with the supporting schedules. He was quiet. "Gerald said I was being paranoid," she added. "Is Gerald usually right?" She thought about 6 years. She thought about the reconciliation system, the audit penalties, the promotions that had gone to people who brought Gerald coffee and laughed at his stories. "No," she said, "Gerald is usually not right." The man turned and looked at her then, fully, for the first time. His eyes were dark and very still, and she had the disconcerting sensation of being read, not looked at. Like she was a document he was assessing for accuracy. "Wren," he said. It startled her. She hadn't told him her name. He must have seen it on her face because he glanced, almost imperceptibly, toward the badge she'd been given at the door and clipped to her clutch and then forgotten about. Her name and department, printed in small, clean letters. "Wren Mallory, Finance." "Voss," he said. Not an introduction. More like a declaration. She knew the name. She didn't know why she knew it, not from any Hollis Group file, not from any account she managed. But she knew it the way you knew the name of a weather system before it hit land. Something in the room knew it too. She could feel the slight change in gravity that happened whenever he moved, the way conversations near him shifted, not toward him but away. Careful, like water moving around a stone. "You said the working capital number," Voss said. "Page 47. Yes. What's the discrepancy? Roughly 2.3 million. But that's just the visible part. What's the invisible part?" She looked at him. No one had ever asked her that. Not Gerald, not the external auditors, not the board. They asked about the number they could see and accepted the explanation they were given. Nobody asked what was underneath. "I don't know yet," she said. "I haven't been given access to the subsidiary records." "Why not?" Gerald revoked it. He said I was overstepping. Voss said nothing for a long moment. He picked up his drink again, and this time he finished it, and then he set the glass down on the nearest surface with a precision that felt deliberate, like everything he did was deliberate, like he didn't make accidents. "Who handles your IT access requests?" he said. She stared at him. "I'm sorry. Your system access, who approves it?" "Department head, then Gerald." "Why?" He didn't answer that. He looked across the room to where Bianca was laughing with a cluster of men near the bar, and there was nothing in his expressions. No judgment, no interest, just the same cataloging look he'd had from the beginning. "That number is going to matter," he said. "Before the quarter closes, I know, then you should have access to the subsidiary records." "Gerald," Voss said, "doesn't own the building. She didn't know what that meant. She wasn't sure she was supposed to. He reached into his jacket pocket and put a card on the window ledge beside her. Plain white, a phone number, nothing else. And then he straightened, adjusted his cuff, and walked away from the window into the party without looking back. Wren stood there for a moment. She picked up the card. The number was printed in the same small, clean font that everything about him seemed to be printed in. No name, no company, nothing that would tell her what she was holding. She put it in her clutch, next to her own badge, and went back to looking at the city. 3 days later, her access was reinstated. She found the email at 6:14 in the morning, before her coffee, before her shoes, sitting at the edge of her bed with her laptop balanced on her knees. System access updated per executive authorization. Gerald hadn't sent it. The authorization code was from a department she'd never heard of, a 2-letter prefix she didn't recognize in the Hollis directory. She sat with that for exactly long enough to drink half her coffee. Then she opened the subsidiary records. It took her 4 hours to find the second discrepancy. It took another 2 to find the third. By noon, she had a folder with 11 flagged items and a headache that had moved from behind her left eye to the base of her skull. And she was starting to understand that the 2.3 million she'd seen on page 47 was not the floor of this problem. It was the ceiling of what they wanted her to see. She called the number on the card. It rang twice. "Mallory," he said. "Not a question. How did you know it was me?" "I gave that number to one person." She looked at her folder. "I found more." Silence on his end. Not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that meant he was listening. 11 line items, she said. The initial shift was cosmetic. It would hold up in a standard review. But if you follow the subsidiary chain, the liability didn't disappear. It moved. It's sitting in a holding company that isn't disclosed in the acquisition documents. How much? Closer to 9 million, maybe more, depending on how the contingent obligations are classified. Another silence. Then, "Send it to me. I don't have your email. I'll send you mine." He hung up. Her phone buzzed 8 seconds later with a message. Just an email address, no domain she recognized, and the single word "tonight." She emailed him the folder at 11 p.m. She didn't sleep well. She told herself it was the coffee. He called at 7 the next morning. "I need you in a room," he said, "with someone who can explain these entries to me, not explain them away. Explain them." The person who could explain them is Gerald. "Gerald isn't who I'm asking." She sat up. I don't know who else would have access to." "You built the reconciliation system," Voss said. She went still. "The audit system, last spring. You redesigned it." "How do you know that?" "I pay attention to systems that work." A pause. "You understand the structure better than whoever set this up. You might be able to reconstruct the logic." She looked at her ceiling for a moment. The crack in the plaster above her bed, the one she'd been meaning to report to the super for 8 months. Reconstruct it. How? Work backward from what you found. Map the movement. Find out where it was supposed to end up. That's going to take time I don't have. I have a full audit cycle. You'll be compensated for your time. I'm not asking about compensation. What are you asking about? She was quiet for a second. She was asking about a lot of things. She was asking why a man she'd stood next to for 11 minutes at a gala had reinstated her access and was now calling her before 7 a.m. about a liability she'd found in a file her stepfather had told her to leave alone. She was asking what it meant that he knew about the reconciliation system. She was asking what department used a 2-letter authorization code that didn't appear in any Hollis directory she'd seen. "What is your interest in this?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it had been in that room at the Aldercroft. Level, unhurried, like a man who had made peace with the idea that time worked for him and not the other way around. "Hollis Group has a minority stake held by a third party," he said. "That third party is represented by someone who doesn't like discrepancies that he didn't authorize." She processed that. "You're the third party. I'm the someone who doesn't like discrepancies. That's not an answer. It's the one I'm giving you." She got out of bed. She stood at the window. Different window. Smaller, no city view, just the side wall of the building next door, and a sliver of grey morning sky. Her hand tightened on the phone. She was thinking about Bianca at the gala, easy and bright in her green dress. No one's going to remember your name. She was thinking about Gerald's voice. You're overstepping. She was thinking about $9 million in a holding company that wasn't supposed to exist. Send me a secure file transfer link, she said. I'll sust on the mapping tonight. I'll send access to a workspace, Voss said. Not your home network. Why? Because if someone at Hollis is watching what you access, I'd prefer they watch someone else's server. She stood very still. You think someone's watching. I think your stepfather revoked your access within 48 hours of you finding something, he said. I think that's fast for someone who says you were just being paranoid. She hadn't thought of it like that. She had, somewhere underneath, in the part of her brain that ran all night whether she wanted it to or not, but she hadn't let herself think it all the way through. Okay, she said. The workspace link will be on your phone in an hour. Use the secure browser. She almost asked how he would get something onto her phone. She decided she didn't want to know. Fine, Mallory. She'd almost hung up. She paused. The work you did on the reconciliation system, he said. The note on the second page of the audit memo. You wrote, the previous model assumed honest entry. She remembered writing that. She remembered the silence in the room when she'd presented it, the way Gerald had looked at the ceiling. Yes, she said. Don't assume honest entry, Voss said, on anything you find in that folder. He hung up. She stood at the window for another minute, the phone still warm in her hand. The sliver of sky had lightened, barely, the particular grey of early morning that wasn't quite committed to being day. She made coffee. She opened her laptop. She started from the beginning of the Lachlan file, page 1, and this time she did not assume honest entry on anything. It took her 9 days. She barely slept. She ate at her desk, made lists on paper because she didn't trust the screens, filled a legal pad with connection maps, and then a second one when the first ran out of room. The workspace Voss had sent her was clean and fast and anonymous, and had a feature she'd never seen on any corporate system she'd used. A field for flagging entries as deliberately obscured, separate from incorrectly entered, separate from entry error. Someone had designed that system for exactly this kind of work. She found herself using it more than she expected. On the 6th night, she found the name. Not Gerald's. Not anyone she'd expected. A subsidiary director she'd never heard of. A signature on a single authorization form buried in a batch file from 18 months ago. She sat with that for a long time. She pulled every file she could find that touched that signature. There were 11 of them. 6 showed up in the Lachlan acquisition documents in the same column as the flagged line items. She sent Voss a one-line message. Found the authorization chain. I know whose signature it is. He replied 11 minutes later, I'm coming to you. She stared at that for a moment. Coming to you. Not send it to me. Not upload the file. She looked around her apartment. The second legal pad spread across her kitchen table, the empty coffee mugs. The shoes she'd kicked off 3 days ago, still sitting in the middle of the floor. He arrived at 8 the next morning, in a car she heard but didn't see park. He knocked once. She opened the door and he stood there in a coat that was too heavy for the weather, with the same stillness he'd had at the Aldercroft, and he looked at the legal pads on her table before he looked at her. You handwrote the map, he said. I don't trust screens with this. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite approval, more like recalibration. He stepped inside and she stepped back, and he stood at her kitchen table and looked at the second legal pad, the connection map, and she watched him read it. He was quiet for a long time. Aldgate, he said finally, the name from the authorization chain. You know him. I know of him. He turned a page of the legal pad carefully, like he was handling something that might not survive rough handling. He's been on Hollis's board of directors for 2 years. He authorized the liability shift before the acquisition, 18 months ago, before he joined the board. Yes, Voss looked up. His eyes were steady and dark, and she had the same sensation as the gala, being read, being assessed for accuracy, for load-bearing capacity. He moved into position ahead of the deal, he said. That's not opportunistic. That's planned. Yes. Over what timeline? Based on what I can map, at least 24 months. Probably longer. He looked back at the legal pad. She watched him think, which wasn't something she'd expected to be able to observe. She'd assumed his thoughts would be as invisible as everything else about him. But there was a slight change in the quality of his stillness, a weight that gathered behind his eyes. And she found she could read it even though she couldn't have explained how. "What happens when this goes to the board?" she said. "It won't go to the board." "Then where?" He straightened. He adjusted his cuff. The same gesture as the gala, automatic, the kind of thing a body did when a decision had been made and the body was just catching up. To people who handle things that boards can't. She thought about what that meant and decided not to ask, because she already knew the answer, and asking it out loud would make it real in a way she wasn't ready for. "What happens to Gerald?" she said instead. Voss looked at her. There was something careful in the look, not gentle exactly, but considered. "Gerald didn't know," he said. "How do you know that?" "Because Gerald revoked your access when you found the discrepancy. That's the action of a man protecting something he knows is fragile. But he didn't understand what you'd actually found. If he'd known the scope of it, he wouldn't have revoked your access. He would have let you close the file and promoted you." She sat down at her kitchen table, on the edge of the chair closest to her, because her legs made the decision before she did. She thought about 6 years. She thought about Gerald's voice. "You're overstepping." She thought about the way he'd looked at the ceiling when she'd presented the audit memo, and she understood now that what she'd seen on his face wasn't dismissal. It was fear. He was trying to protect the deal, she said. He was trying to protect what he thought was a clean deal, and Bianca doesn't have anything to do with this. She knew that. She'd known that the whole time. It didn't make it simpler. Voss picked up the legal pad and held it with both hands, looking at the last page of her connection map. His left hand was the one she'd noticed at the gala, the fingers slightly curled, the old reflex. Up close, she could see that the knuckle of his index finger was scarred, and that the scar was very old, and that he had stopped noticing it a long time ago. "You should have had access to this from the beginning," he said. "I know, the fact that you found it anyway." He stopped, set the legal pad down. She waited. "The fact that you found it anyway," he said again, "is not a small thing. It was not a compliment, delivered the way he delivered it. It was a statement of fact, the same way he said everything, the same way she wrote numbers, without decoration, without apology, because accuracy was its own argument. She found, to her own surprise, that it meant more than a compliment would have. "What happens next?" she said. "I take the file. And me." He looked at her, not a question in it. He'd understood what she was actually asking, which was not what happens to me, but am I done? "Not yet," he said. "There are other records I haven't been able to access. The holding company's internal ledger, if you're right about the structure. And there's a second authorization chain. Someone had to approve the holding company's formation. That would be a different signature. Yes, that could take time." He said it without apology. "It will take time." She looked at the window. The city was fully awake now, the particular noise of late morning, buses and delivery trucks, and someone's radio from the floor above. She thought about the crack in her ceiling, and the legal pads on her table, and the shoes still in the middle of the floor, and the 9 days she'd spent not sleeping, and she tried to locate the feeling that was sitting in the center of her chest. Not fear, not exactly. Something more like the moment before a number resolves, when you know you're close but you don't have the final figure yet. "All right," she said. Voss picked up the legal pads, both of them. He tucked them under his arm with the same deliberate precision he put on everything, and he turned toward the door. "Mallory," he said. She looked at him. "The holding company was formed under a name that won't appear in any Hollis document, but it will appear somewhere. Things always appear somewhere. You sound very certain about that." "I am." She crossed her arms. "Because you've looked for things before. Because I am very good," he said, "at knowing what exists and where it is." He said it without weight, without performance. Just a fact, offered the same way she offered facts, because they were true and being true was sufficient reason to say them. He left. She stood in her kitchen with the legal pads gone, and the table bare and the coffee cups still in their places, and she thought he had not told her what he was. He had not told her who the third party was, or what the authorization code meant, or why he knew about her reconciliation system, or how something had ended up on her phone. He had given her exactly what she needed to do the work, and nothing else. She found that she was already thinking about the second authorization chain. She pulled a fresh legal pad from the drawer, the one she'd bought 6 days ago, thinking she might not need it, and she sat down at the kitchen table, and she wrote holding company formation at the top of the first page, and she started from the beginning.